Section 4 of the Gypsy Wife quilt by Jen Kingwell seems like a very easy section. There are 2 blocks. One block is Courthouse Steps and the other one is half square triangle. Courthouse Steps with 3 rows expanding out is the next block in section 4. So we start with the center square and then border that short on, I like to do short on top and bottom and then long on the sides. Border that with the next round. And then the last round. So there are 3 rounds in Courthouse Steps for section 4. And here's my finished Courthouse Steps. The half square triangle. And I have 8 background squares and then 8 scrappy squares. So there are 16 half square triangles in this block. So each of these scrappy squares will make 2 half square triangle squares. There's many different ways to make half square triangles, and I've been doing it by cutting the squares in half diagonally and then sewing the 2 triangle pieces together. But for this block, what I'm going to do is place the background square and the scrappy square together, and then I'm going to draw a line down the center diagonally. Instead of cutting it, I'm going to draw a line. And I'm using purple pen on a purple square, so hopefully that's visible. And then what I'm going to do is go to the sewing machine and stitch on either side of that line, and then after it's stitched, I will cut on that line. Now at the sewing machine, I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch seam allowance on either side of that line. Come to the end, I can just flip it around and do the other side. Then what I'm going to do is cut this diagonal here, and that will give me 2 identical half square triangle squares. So for this block, there are 16 of these squares needed. I'm going to go ahead and stitch the rest of my blocks and then I will assemble it. So here are all of the half square triangle squares stitched. I'm going to cut them down the diagonal, trim them up with the dog ears, and press them to one side, and then I'm going to assemble the block. The thing about these half square triangles is that they don't always come out the perfect square when you sew the triangles together, despite what method or efforts that you make. So what I need to do is trim down to a square after I've pressed open my block. So you can see I've got all my little trimlings here. And I trimmed each of these squares to the 2.5 inches it's supposed to be. And then I'm going to start assembling. This half square triangle block uses the triangles in rows, and the background fabric is all facing the same direction. So assembly is fairly easy. Now if you used scraps like I did and did not duplicate anything, you can just randomly put them together. But I don't want any duplicates right next to each other, so I'm going to be a little more careful about the placement that I do. It's still fairly scrappy. But I do have all of the background fabrics facing in one direction. So now it's just assembly by rows. So sew all of the squares for each row together, and then assemble the rows together to form the final block. A few tips with this block: as you sew the rows, press the squares to one side, but alternate the pressing. So one row goes this way, pressing this way, the next row goes this way, this one goes this way, and this one goes this way. And that will help keep your block flat when you sew the rows together. Another tip is to pin the points. So every time there's a point, pin it together when you sew the rows together. One thing I really love about the Gypsy Wife quilt is being able to use all of these fun, funky fabrics that I probably would never use otherwise. I like fun, funky fabrics. I like that it's an alliteration. And it's so exciting to be able to use these in a quilt that can really showcase them individually as well as blend together to make one cohesive quilt. Section 4 is just those two blocks, Courthouse Steps and half square triangles.